Professor Juliette Kayyem has spent the last 2 decades in both state and federal government managing complex policy initiatives and organizing government responses to major crises. Kayyem is the Robert and Renee Belfer Senior Lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she is Faculty Chair of the Homeland Security and Security and Global Health Projects. Previously, she served as President Obama's Assistant Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security, and before that, as the Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor. As a CNN National Security Analyst, Pulitzer Prize finalist, and contributor for The Atlantic and WGBH, Kayyem also advises governors, mayors, and corporations on crisis management, especially during the COVID-19 response. Over to you, Juliette.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you all for coming. This is a big crowd, and I am excited. Anything to wake us up on this cold and chilly New England morning. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about where we are in terms of this programming. I was with some of you a year ago when executive programs, like everyone else, went online and tried to reach out to our community about what was going on and to continue to provide resources and lessons about what was happening to us. A year later, a lot has changed. But it does look familiar. And so for those of you who were here a year ago, which our understanding is there's a lot of you, I'm going to begin where I ended and fast forward a bit. And the goal of today is to both ground you where we are. And I know it's an international audience, so I will be speaking the sort of where the US is, but some of you are slightly ahead. Some of you are, unfortunately, as we're seeing in India and elsewhere, behind. But this is what the trajectory of what 2021 is likely to look like for most of us, and what it means for adaptive recovery, which I will describe, resiliency for moving forward after COVID, and then how the old threats never went away. In other words, it's time we have to recognize the threats that we face. The goal of this is obviously to give you the skills and as I'd like to always say, the grounding in crisis management and what that looks like, and also provide what we call the sort of greasing the runway, just a sense of how to extend the runway through 2021. As many of you are leaders, CEOs, run institutions, about just how should you be thinking about 2021 for yourself, your community, your institution, your employees, and even your families if it comes to that. So without further ado, let me so open with the first slide, which is the introduction to me, which you already got. So we'll pass that quickly. So basically, in crisis management, I'm going to be moving to what we call the right side of the boom. So let me go to the next slide. Okay. Here we are. So those of you who were here a year ago, remember this very, very complicated, it's not that complicated slide, which divides crisis management into 2 phases. Essentially, there's five stages, but there's essentially sort of 2 phases. What we call left of boom. So if you're looking at my slide, is the sort of what can we control and prepare for before the bad thing happens. And then the boom, which in this case, it's COVID, but it could be the hurricane, the tornado, the terrorist incident, the oil spill, the cyber attack. And then what we call the second phase, which is right of boom, which is response, adaptive recovery, although it's generally called recovery. For COVID, I'm calling it adaptive recovery and resiliency. So let me just take you back, not that we want to relive 2020, but we have to go back to go forward. So 2020 obviously begins, although maybe it even began in 2019, with an oncoming pandemic. And we can look at our different countries in terms of what they did before you would have massive community spread. None of our countries, for the most part, with a few exceptions, were able to control the spread. Some did it better than others. Some did it without the kind of stresses on the health facilities and hospital facilities. Some did it with a lot fewer deaths than, say, the United States, Brazil, or India is likely to have. But these are the factors around, global health systems, transparency, food security. And then, of course, in the early months of 2020, attempts to contain and prevent our healthcare systems from faltering. That essentially is what flattening the curve was about for most of our countries. Was you just simply wanted to slow the infection rate so that those who got sick would not stress the system, would not come in all at the same time. And so the questions about how well did our countries prepare our healthcare systems, protect our frontline workers, create surge capacity and supply chain capacity around test kits. In the United States, which this slide is adapted for, we tend to call those months the squandered times. No politics here. It's just those months were squandered. In other words, we knew we could not contain it. I don't think we had an extent of the community spread, and we did not prepare enough. So that's why we had things like not enough masks or issues like not enough masks or testing kits. Okay, that's, lots of lessons learned, which we're going to get into later. But nonetheless, just to conceptually think, okay, so I've got these options in terms of protection and prevention that get me basically to February, March. Italy's earlier, China's earlier, Europe is about the same time as us. And there'll be different waves, as we're now seeing with Brazil and India. In crisis management, there's two kinds of boom. Boom is anything. So when you think about preparing for crises, we tend to think agnostically, right? You can focus on different risks and what you need to do to protect yourself from risk. But in terms of crisis management, in terms of how am I thinking about this, the boom is agnostic. So I started in counterterrorism. I don't consider myself a counterterrorism expert anymore. I'm what we call an all hazards expert. And those of you who lead institutions really need to become that. If you look too much at cyber, you're going to not be prepared for health. If you look too much at a health crisis, you won't be prepared for a climate crisis. So we like to think holistically. And so we just generically call it the boom. But there are two types of boom. One is the immediate, the bomb goes off, right? Think Boston Marathon bombing. That is like, there's 1 minute, and then the next minute, something's happened in some weird way. And in the weird way that people like me talk about good news, in a weird way, those are easier because there's no question about activation. The bomb goes off, the tornado comes through the town, the hurricane, the tsunami, the earthquake, whatever it is, whatever it is the risk is, the active shooter, the cyber attack, it's happening. So the delivery resources doesn't become an issue. The challenge for the pandemic, and as we also see for climate change crises, which is a big issue today, of course, with the global summit going on. So the problem with a pandemic like climate change is that there's no single moment of clarity. So for those of you who do think about sort of how will I be better prepared next time, a huge issue is what we call situational awareness. Do you have an understanding of what is coming your way? Most global employers, including supply chain, think of toilet paper, paper towels, all this, were caught pretty much flat-footed because of the pandemic. They had a just-in-time supply chain, right, that just sort of, could take into account bad weather for a few days, or God forbid, the Suez Canal or something like that. But you weren't really impacted by the disruption that would ultimately occur because of COVID. And so the question of when to activate becomes really hard for employers, for those of us who had families, for, what is that moment? In the United States, you kind of sort of felt it coming. We tend to think of that moment as being the Saturday night in mid-March 2020, when the NBA closed down for the season, and the same night that our sort of Hollywood royalty, Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson, announced that they had it. That night, literally the next week, is when most institutions began to close, including Harvard. We would announce a closing. Actually, an email went out that weekend hinting of a closing, saying test your systems, and we would close by that Friday. And so you have different responses. So when you think about crisis management, do you have the capacity to anticipate something that is not immediate, that's an emergent threat? So you think about climate change or the next health scare. Okay, quickly, now we're right a boom. All sorts of the stuff has hit the fan, as we say. And I'm not going to go through response. Each country basically had the same response. It was, I mean, some did it better than others because they were more unified, they were more draconian, but basically it was, we're going to flatten the curve. We got to slow down what's happening. Now, remember, the good news is at the same time, we're getting better with treatments. We're now identifying the vaccine. There's manufacturing of the vaccine or testing the vaccine. So what's interesting is I didn't know that this was happening, but parallel to all the horribleness starting in March for most of us, you did have a parallel effort on letting us survive it if we got it, but also the end game, which is vaccination. And so in each country, the response takes on the same view, right? It's personal. We behave in a certain way. Public sector, the government is demanding that we behave in a certain way. And then institutional, right? I mean, most institutions close sooner than most public entities, whether it's colleges, universities, museums, sporting events. And so it's what we call unity of effort, right? It's not the government saying do this, although the government was in some instances saying do this or not do this. Institutions also had a key role, as they will in the exit. Okay. So I got you through that horrible year or somewhat, and I don't put dates. It's March 2020 is essentially February 2020, March 2020. And a lot of us, some of our countries, we've gone through the multiple waves because we didn't quite do it right, or we opened too soon, or whatever it is. But as I said, I don't want to look back. I want to look forward. And the lessons learned will be significant, obviously. So where are we now? So in normal crisis management, we have the notion of recovery. So the response ends, and then you move to recovery. And then the thinking about recovery is, whether it's when the media leaves or when the bodies are identified and the debris is picked up. That's a crude way that we put it in crisis management, right? So you're out of that immediate response, and now you're we want to get people back to normal. Those of you who are in Boston, you want the trains running again. So those of you in Boston, so think like Monday, right? So Monday is Monday Boston Marathon Day. There's a terrorist attack. And then there's a search, right? So you really are thinking about a week of sort of response. And then by that Friday, those of you who remember the calendar of the Boston Marathon, by that Friday, when one of the assailants is killed, the other one is captured, then you start to think about recovery, where we're going to begin to open up. So what the concept that I've come up with then is different for 2021 in this world. And I think it's actually probably true of most booms that we are going to get. And it's try to think of it as adaptive recovery. And we're here, I sort of put we are here because I don't know where you all are coming from. We're sort of like both in response and adaptive recovery stage. And we're at the stage for most of us where we are, especially in Europe and elsewhere, where we're starting to figure out, as more people get vaccinated, sort of what does this, what I call the now normal, not the new normal, right? Because the new normal assumes that that's static, right? That we've gone from one phase to the other. 2021 is hard because each week, each outbreak is going to bring is going to demand the necessity of potentially a crisis response. In other words, you may have to go back and forward depending on what we're seeing in each community. So it's hard to do, but thinking of it as the now normal, like today, these are what my numbers are. This is what my institution looks like. And I'm going to bring people back, but I'm only going to bring 20% of them back. Oh my goodness, so a certain percentage of them got infected. Everyone's back home. Or this is working great. I'm going to bring 50% back. You are going to, so you can understand the adaptive part of it, is that it's not a place that we're getting to. It's a capability. It's a capacity to pivot. And so you'll still need all the old things that you needed, because all of our countries, I mean, we're still in a pandemic in the sense that it's still out there. We are adapting to living with COVID as we try to eliminate it, or at least reduce the risk. And at the same time, right, if you do get it, we're better about our capacity to live with it, right? People are identified earlier, there's better treatments, and of course, the vaccine. So it's sort of a continuum of both response and recovery as we head through the year. And a couple other factors before I get to the next slide, or the next two slides, is the now normal also assumes that you have to go backwards. And we will have to be prepared to shut it down, whether it's school districts or whatever else, as new outbreaks emerge. What we're seeing in the United States is also what we're seeing in Europe, which is urban, the 50% of the population, would like, basically kill their mother to get the vaccine at this stage, right? The other 50% is more difficult. I'm going to talk about what the numbers are telling us globally about herd immunity. But I'm an optimist. Things are getting better. Like, even if you're not at herd immunity, we are managing to live with the virus until the vaccine. So that's my second point, or as the vaccine, I shouldn't say until, as the vaccine and herd immunity, right? That we are adapting around it. Okay, so what does that adaptation look like as we head to the last phase of crisis management, which is what the heck did we learn to make us stronger for the next time? Time for next slide. Okay, so this is what adaptive recovery looks like. You've got the background of vaccinations happening. We love it. We can probably unmask, as Israel has done, outside and control transmission in more social ways, right? I mean, in other words, we now know how to do this. So this will not feel like February and March of 2020 anymore, but it won't be without adaptations, I guess. So I sort of think of it as a safe and slow return to normal, or the now normal, right? So I'm as excited as all of you. I've had 3 kids home, as many of you. So the way to think about it, and if you are leading something or managing something, is in, the famous Kennedy School 3, we always like everything in 3s, starting with the same letter. So I figured that out. So first, you want to minimize contact intensity. Gyms and cafeterias are just different than office cubicles, right? So as we bring people back, we are going to think differently about one place versus another. Indoor restaurant dining different than outdoor restaurant dining. The intensity, we now know, is what led to the transmission, and we just want to protect as many people as possible. The second tier is you want to manage the number of contacts. So think about how the Kennedy School has done its re-entry. And I love this because they're also testing the system, or what we call stress testing the system, before everyone comes back, or as many people as we can get back, come back in the fall, in the fall. So we're opening up slowly. And that means managing the number of contacts. We're only bringing back a certain number of students, international students, and only a certain number of faculty. I have not returned back to my office since the summer when I was there, and I'm just teaching from here. So we're just trying to make sure, if you're going to go to the Red Sox game, it's only 25% full. That's still good, right? We still love it. It's outdoor. There's no reason that we can't get to 50% eventually. Maybe even 75%. It's still good. It's just not 100% yet. And then you want to continue to maximize mitigation policies. So I'm a big fan of masking. It's a respiratory disease. I am also a big fan of not masking unless you need to. So indoors is different than outdoors. I think schools should continue to have masking requirements until we know a little bit more, or we get to herd immunity. And so thinking about what that ways that you personally can mitigate the harm that we do to each other is important. If you're sick, if you're an employee, if you're sick, stay home, right? I mean, these are basic, be a good person. And for the most part, despite all the politics, in particular in the United States, about masking, for the most part, the American public gets it. So there's the politics that you see on TV. For the most part, the American public was at its height, 75 to 80% in support of masking. They get respiratory diseases. They also now want to take off their masks when they're outside. That makes sense too, given what we know. Okay, so this is what adaptive recovery, this is what you're going to be doing every day. And I'm sure a lot of you do this in your own personal life, right? You just didn't give it a nice chart, right? This is what you're thinking. Do you want to go here? I'll go to outdoor restaurants. I'm fully vaccinated tomorrow. I don't think a lot about going to movie theaters. Not yet. Maybe I will. So we're all sort of playing around with this balancing act. Okay, so that is adaptive recovery, and we're going to be at different stages in the triangle, depending on what's happening in our community, what the rules are, what our employers want, and what our employees want. And that's where I want to get to finally, before I get to all the bad things that are still out there. One of the important things about crisis management, and so I hope if I do this again in a year, although I'm hoping that we don't have to do this again remotely, one of the things is obviously to do better next time, right? I mean, in other words, if you look at my original chart, 2 charts back, it's actually a loop, right? That the right of boom, response, recovery, and resiliency loops back, that the stronger, the better you are after the fact, mitigates the potential harm again. My next book is actually about how disasters are no longer random and rare. In other words, how we have to prepare for perpetual crises, because that's our reality, right? We tend to always be shocked by it, but maybe we can build systems that are actually better prepared for the crisis, because the better prepared you are, the less likely the less damage you'll have, the fewer casualties you have, and the stronger you will be for the next time. So I'm big on lessons learned, resiliency, sort of what do we look like in the future. So, but before I get to this, let me just say one quick thing about vaccinations, because those of you, predominant majority of you are from the United States, and other countries, Israel way ahead of us, but the United States is in pretty good shape, but Europe is getting, the EU is getting its act together, Britain in good shape, other countries way too slow. But those things happen in big logistics plans, and we'll figure it out. So it looks like in most Western democracies, and this is, I think, really good news, about 50% of the population really, really wants a vaccination bad. And that's about where we are. About 200 million have been vaccinated. We are now at the molasses stage of hesitancy. We should not view hesitancy as people don't want it. That group is relatively small. Even in the United States, where we have a big anti-vax movement, it's about 11%, but it's not 50%. So we have this gap between the 200 million that have gotten 1 or 2 shots in the U.S. and the remaining, and that really gets to hesitancy. That's hesitancy, but it's hesitancy that's related to access. We tend to view those as separate things. Access is one issue. Hesitancy is a political issue or a theoretical issue. Don't view it that way. People will get vaccinated if you make it easier. And so what you're going to start to see in all of these countries is a move from bigger is better, right? These big mass vax sites, get everyone in, everyone wants a shot, whatever, to the more intimate stage, or what I call the molasses stage, right? This is we've hit, for those who, I'm a long distance runner, we have hit the vaccine wall. And now we just have to pivot. We just have to change our pacing. That means reiterating that it's free. So it means employers. So those of you who are employers or are part of human resources, whatever, take a look at the new IRS rules regarding this. Give your people time off, create a vaccination site at your facility, depending on how big it is. We want pop-up vaccination sites, every CVS, every Walgreens. It is going to look a lot more intimate, but it will be slower, right? So these great trajectories that you've seen in all these countries, right? It will peak. There's no point in freaking out about it. It's just, now we pivot to the more intimate stage. So that's sort of where we are in the United States in terms of crisis management. I know people are freaking out about it and online, and oh my God, we have not hit the anti-vax people. We got to separate hesitant from anti-vaxxers. And the anti-vaxxers are a small group. And honestly, we don't need them for herd immunity. We need the hesitant crowd. And the hesitant crowd is often hesitant because of access issues. So think about what role you can play in that, and what role government subsidies can help motivate you or your employer in that. Okay, so finally, before I get to the old is new again, there are significant ways in which you can see life changing, and the data is already showing it. Just as I was getting online, Ford announced, I think, or GM announced it was going to institute a work, I forget what they called it. They all have fancy names, but a work better policy, which is they are going to cater or listen to their employees and what they wanted. So I think there will be permanent workforce and workplace changes that will have an impact on cybersecurity and what your institution and the demands on your institution. But polling employees is showing that people kind of like this. A lot of people want to go in, but they don't want to go in every day. They see that they can do this. That's maybe a little bit different for onboarding people, right? So new people may want to come in more. Younger people who have been really isolated, the 20, 30 somethings, may want to go into places, but anticipate these permanent workforce changes. There are going to be changes to global public health security. So whether it is having global vaccination plans and distribution plans, but more importantly, identification planning, right? Was China not transparent enough? The answer is probably yes. But what can we do to motivate transparency and a better global public health security effort? Third, and I won't go through all of these, just a couple, a woman in the workforce, which is very important. And that's related to, I think, critical infrastructure. We tend to think of critical infrastructure as the things that make society run: logistics, water, electricity, communications, transportation. It turns out for all of our countries that schools are a critical infrastructure, not just for our children and for education, but obviously its impact on women in the workforce. Goldman Sachs sort of assesses that even for white collar women, well, this was a women's recession globally because it tended to impact women's jobs, but also because, as Goldman Sachs notes, anywhere from 12 to 17%, depending on when it's done, women who had to, I put it in quotes, voluntarily leave the workforce because of the demands of childcare. That we simply, many of our countries did not have the capacity to allow women to continue to work. United States, the worst of all of them, but we saw this globally. So hopefully there'll be changes to thinking about both schools as a critical infrastructure. In other words, if you close them, we better figure out alternatives or open them quickly, which I'm a proponent of, and its impact of women in the workforce. I will say, as someone who's traveled all my life as a working mother and had the benefit of a partner who does not travel, which I don't think we could have done. I could have done what I wanted to do if he traveled. He doesn't travel for work. There might also be benefits, long-term benefits to women in the workforce. We're not seeing them now. This has been a hit to feminism and workforce issues for women. But things like travel, all of a sudden, someone like me used to be on a plane. People say, "Are you going to start traveling again?" I go, no one's asking, right? Most of the things I do now, people are quite content. And my first business trip is not on a calendar till November. I'm sure there'll be stuff before that, but we've all changed in terms of what our demands are. So you can see what the rest are in terms of efforts to protect the economy, to protect our gig economy. And those of you in corporations, the final thing I want to just raise is the rise of what we call the chief health officer. So I'm in the world of crisis management. I advise a lot of companies. I train a lot of CEOs. And just the trajectory over the last 20 years. So after 9/11, you had the rise of the chief security officer. It tended to be a former police officer, police chief, who was assessing the physical security. This was also workplace violence, guns and things like that. So you had the chief security officer. Then fast forward about 10 years, and you have the rise of the chief information security officer. That was the person, generally former FBI or Secret Service, who was in these large companies, who was assessing the cyber risks and preparing the company should there be a cyber attack. So you had CSO, CISO. You are starting to see globally, and you just look online, the rise of either the chief health officer or the chief medical officer. So those of you in the private sector, this is what's happening, is that so many companies just felt like they had no idea what was going on. They didn't like advice from government. They didn't know what to do, that they are bringing this capacity in-house. Someone who is looking at health threats as a security vulnerability for the company. I find this very interesting from a governance perspective in terms of crisis management. I urge integration of these three types of people, because you can have different silos, which is never good. But I do think it's an important aspect to our global economy, especially companies that are in supply chain that are satisfying our critical infrastructure needs. Okay, so this hopefully may be my last one with you, except the title. I did not tell you the title of my next book, which is called The Devil Never Sleeps. It will be out in a year. The first draft is due this summer, so I complain out loud. So my head is down for a little bit, but the idea of The Devil Never Sleeps is that is a quote that came to me after a crisis from a community member who said, I was remarking on the city's resiliency or the town's resiliency after a tornado. And she said, the devil never sleeps. He only wins if we don't do better next time. In other words, these threats will be recurring. And in fact, they didn't go away. So when I think about the threats for 2021, let me just go through the other three. There may be another pandemic. Hopefully we'll be better at it. Hopefully we can get this one under control. But it's not like, oh, we did that one, it's over, right? I mean, it's not like, oh, yeah, that was the global pandemic of this century, and then we're going to get it by. Just given the nature of our global economy, this is something that is that we have to face. This is why I think companies are institutionalizing the chief health officer, the chief medical officer. You're sort of, we're going to bring a Dr. Fauci in, right, or a Sanjay Gupta from CNN. There are three other non-state threats that most of us who are not in government, obviously in government, you're thinking about state threats and what the Iranians are doing if you're in the US, or what China is doing if you're South Korea, so you've got your typical state threats. But for most of us who are either civilians or who are civilians, who are out of government or the military, we will have these recurring other threats. Now, they never went away in 2020 or even 2021, and we're starting to see them again in important ways so we can focus on them. And so my goal here is to just think of these, right, through that crisis management prism is, what are we doing to prevent and protect ourselves before the incident? And then what are we doing? Are we prepared after to minimize the harm? So we have an idea of risk minimization. Those of you who may be in insurance or risk assessors, right? So your high probability, high consequence events, all that stuff that we do in crisis management. What's the thing that's most likely to happen, that is most likely to damage the most, right? So this is what risk assessors do. We have to begin to think about consequence minimization. In other words, that the measure of success is that fewer people died or there was less harm, right? Rather than thinking of crises as binary, did it happen or didn't it? Given the nature of the kind of threats we face and the difficulty it is to stop all of them, right? The devil never sleeps. We need to begin to think about consequence reduction, right? That will be a measure of success. That the difference between, let's just be honest about the United States. The difference between 50,000 dead and 600,000 dead is success, right? No one would say 50,000 dead is success, but when you compare it with the consequences of what we would experience, obviously it is. Okay, so the other three threats, just no surprise here, but in terms of booms, this is what people like me think about, the borderless threats. People in the space of I can't control what the government of China does, but I worry about other things that China may have some influence in, or Russia. So of course, the first is cybersecurity, and not just to our election systems or other things, but of course to our critical infrastructure. We are in a wired war, as they say, with China and Russia. That involves not only disruption of critical infrastructure, but obviously disinformation. We are seeing that played out even in vaccination, that the anti-vax movement is closely aligned or at the mercy, I'll be favorable to Russia propaganda and Russian disinformation. But to the extent that cybersecurity sort of encompasses everything from, are your networks protected, to does 2 + 2 = 4, right? In other words, the disinformation. We have to be aware of its impact on increasing the likelihood that something bad will happen. I worry most about critical infrastructure, of course, and in terms of cybersecurity, what we always say is, do not have a single point of failure, right? When you look at the big hacks those are ones that are, that there was a single point of failure, a single access point that a sophisticated cyber attacker took advantage of, but it wasn't rocket science, right? It was not, it was, think of Sony, right? A single system administrator and a single password, right? So think about systems of layered defenses to protect your systems. The second is climate change in terms of both mitigation, right? How do we stop it? That's the conversation today with all the global leaders, and of course, response across the globe. We will be facing climate refugees. We will be facing forced readiness for our militaries and their capacity to respond, whether it's the Navy and the oceans, or it's in the United States, our Air Force bases being vulnerable to tornadoes and hurricanes. This is for real in terms of our own security, and it will change the way that we live. So you think about incentives to change to, whether tax incentives or disaster management incentives, disaster management funding says pay people to live more resilient, right? So move away from the seashore. This is going to be a fundamental shift in all of our countries as we not only try to mitigate the harm, future harms, but we need to adapt to what is too late. I hate to say that, but it's just different. I mean, the nature of the climate challenges are different. And then finally, radicalization, which is hitting all of our countries in different forms, whether it's white supremacy here in the United States, neo-Nazism, or other radicalization elements. I tend to not think of a binary domestic foreign. We see ties between white supremacy here and in Europe or New Zealand or Australia, other countries that are facing radicalization issues. And it's deeply tied into what a lot of you are seeing now, a discussion of what's called the Great Replacement, right? The sense that America is too diversified and that we will be a majority non-Caucasian. I don't say non-white because Hispanics sometimes define themselves as white, but non-Caucasian country. This is a radicalizing theory because it justifies violence. So don't just think of the Great Replacement, right? This idea that motivates most white supremacy as, oh, it's just racism. It's not. It's a more toxic aspect of white supremacy, and that is related to the justification for violence to eradicate the other, right? The other being the person who's apparently replacing you. It's a very, very scary time that these are part of our dialogues, and one that we're going to have to address for decades to come because of its impact on certain communities, disinformation, and of course our election systems. So this is where we are in 2021. I said the other day that the old is new again, and the new is now normal. And so this is how we adapt and embrace and prepare for the next time in terms of crisis management. I am a big fan of knowledge is empowering. So if you think, why does she have such a happy disposition? If I do, it is because only by grounding people and being honest with them can we try to do better next time. So that's my goal for all of you as well. And now I think I turn it back to Catherine or Jamie, or I'm not sure who.
Yes.
1 minute. 1 minute. I was almost perfect.
It was perfect. Thank you so much, Juliette. As you said, we'll now open it up to questions. If you have a question, please use the raise hand button. We will call on you and unmute your mic so you can ask your question live. Alternatively, you may use the Q&A function as mentioned to submit your question in writing. And thank you to those who have already submitted a few questions there. But we'll open it up if anyone would like to raise their hand and kick us off with a question. Okay, we have Sarah Stadt.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and talk today. So I was kind of curious on the section you were talking about where after the boom, where we're in this like kind of triage and trying to make our way towards recovery situation. One thing I've noticed in the pandemic is that essentially like scientists, virologists, even Harvard's Chan School of Public Health, where they have great advice about like indoor air cleaners and CO2 monitoring and all of these tools to really reduce risk of spread. They've just had the hardest time breaking through the noise and communicating and helping the public and leadership like resource themselves.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts on when we're at these points in crises and the noise is so high and it seems like access to really solid advice becomes difficult to find, even for leadership? I still don't hear this stuff out of government leaders. So how does science break through in these moments?
It's a great point. And I have strong opinions about this. Are you from tell me where you're from. Are you in the science world, or are you, what world are you in?
Actually, I'm a fellow at Georgetown's Beck Center. I'm an SCF alum, and last 7 years at the intersection of public health and environmental health. So more the science of like safety of humans in places than trees, right? And so that's related.
Well, it's nice to hear from you. And I'm going to ask Jamie, Science Magazine. So this is really a great question, because I've been thinking about this. So Science Magazine did a long interview with me because, remember, I'm a consumer of health intelligence. I'm a planner. I don't second guess the intelligence. So what are people in the public health and science world telling me? And I then try to adapt institutions and whoever. And I worked a lot with mayors through the Kennedy School Bloomberg program and with governors in terms of setting up vaccination sites. So I'm a tactical person. So to me, health intelligence was no different than foreign intelligence about a terrorist group. That it's imperfect. It adapts over time. So look, in the United States, that was, maybe that was a presidency of one, right? In other words, the noise. Well, there's, I think, 2 points I want to make. One is the public health message was getting out. So if you just, and I'm on CNN, so I can complain about them, but if you just get out of cable news, if you look at any of the polling, even the vaccination polling, right? Even the polling around vaccinations is related to high agreement by the American public. So as I said, masking was always at 75, 80%. Social distancing was agreed upon generally in high majorities. And even vaccination, you have a hesitancy group, but you have a much lower group as well. So you have the group that that's in between. I really want it and I'm never going to get it, right? So that's the group you want. So one is that message was getting through, but it wasn't getting through the politics. It was getting through to your local doctor, people, local news, whatever. So part of that is just a more tactical thing. And what's interesting is the data showing that of the hesitant crowd, what's convincing them, they're sick of Dr. Fauci. There's no question about it. We love him, but apparently lots of people are sick of him because I think that they want different messengers. So that gets to my point in the Science Magazine thing, which is about public health sticking to their lane. So this is where I'm a little bit critical of public health. I think it's my opinion, but this is my, that because maybe they were on the defensive, too much of the decisions for decision makers, which was not the public health people, it's a mayor, it's a governor, it's a CEO, was binary. In other words, was you either listen to us or you don't, right? And I think the challenge is that actually in a global pandemic, there's many relevant lanes, right? There's the economic lane, right? The economic impact, and what would that mean to close down for that long? The school impact, other issues, and sometimes I think insensitive is too strong of a word, and read my interview, because I think I was a little bit more careful than I'm probably being right now. But I think part of what public health can learn also is that these other factors are actually quite relevant. And I think some of the criticisms that you're hearing about public health now is maybe it's too slow to let up, that whether it's masking or whatever else. So I think there's lessons to learn on both sides. I think the politics that happened, but it wasn't just politics, it was how the US responded, in my mind, unforgivable, lots of lessons learned. I understand the binary nature of the messaging, but I think as science communicators do the lessons learned, part of it may also be not presenting the binary, that health intelligence is as iffy as other intelligence. And what you saw CEOs and governors and mayors clamoring for was, help me pivot around COVID, after the initial shutdown. And I think you're seeing some of that pressure now.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for that question. We have lots of good ones coming in. We'll get to as many as we can. Roberta, would you like to ask your question?
This is Roberta from the Philippines, Director of my Research Innovation Center. Thank you, Harvard, for inviting me. And so I would like to ask, how do you avoid exacerbation of inequalities while enhancing resiliency?
So I think that you have to think about two phases. And on that big slide that I noticed, someone said, "Can you have it?" I think we'll make the slides available. They're just mine. It's, you can use them for whatever. That one of the challenges in crisis management is that a crisis hits a nation or a community or a company as it is, not as we want it to be, right? So it exposes everything that's bad, rather than curing, right, the things that are bad. So I'm not I can sound harsh at times, but you're not going to fix some of those things in that perfectly. What you can do is begin to address the inequalities or the access issues, in particular on vaccination, that are exposed by the crisis, and then think long term. So we know what works for equity. I mean, there's two ways to think about the equity issues. One is just government policies, right? We know what works, whether it's a minimum wage, whether it's universal health care. I mean, these are big political questions, but it's also about free vaccination programs. What is the thing that turns a person who's reluctant to not reluctant? The number one thing right now, globally, you say it's free. But then all of a sudden people are like, okay, I'll take the vaccine, right? I mean, because these are not people. So one is just the government policies. The other is a capacity for the community, right, to access whatever it is that, whatever those policies are. And so part of what we've learned in the resiliency is obviously critical workers in the United States or elsewhere, or immigrants are of a certain socioeconomic status. What can we do to protect them? What can we do for gig workers and other non-traditional workers who tend to fit inside or outside of norms? And also, I'll just say this to the question before: the greatest change is diversifying the voices within the public health or crisis management system. In other words, the fact that there are people in that world now, it's not just reflective of a socioeconomic standards, a diverse people who are figuring out how to deliver resources to their communities. That is key, because their voices are amplified within the profession. So we're seeing that in public health now, and like we had never seen before. But it's a challenge. I mean, it doesn't get fixed immediately.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I am Mustafa from Gambia. Sorry, I have cold. I lost my voice.
That's okay. Oh, and we just lost you. We lost you and your voice. Mustafa?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. You had pressed mute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is, how does the current crisis compare with the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009? And what lessons do we draw from all these crises in terms of trend over the years? Thank you.
So I'm sorry, I missed that part about the 2008, 2009. You mean the economic?
Yes.
Yeah.
How does it compare with this crisis, the current crisis, and also lessons learned?
Yeah. Right. So the 2008, 2009 crisis, right? So, and one way to think about it is that was famously called a black swan event. In other words, it was low probability but high consequence event that was totally knowable only after the fact, right? We had not enough people saw it coming. In some ways, the pandemic is that way, although lots of people have been screaming about global health pandemics for a while. So here's where they're similar, and here's where they're similar is what I had said before, which is it exposed the inequities in the system, and that the floor was not a stable floor. I think that is in the public health and medical world, as well as the economic world, that floor that people thought could not go anywhere went somewhere, right? It fell apart. And all we could do, right, either economically or with the pandemic, is try to extend the runway, just buy ourselves enough time so that the system didn't totally collapse, whether it was the healthcare system or the economic system, and throw lots of money at the issue. I think, and also it required expertise, all those things, in crisis management, or how do you protect workers? How do you protect communities? I think that the difference, of course, with the pandemic, and something that, I don't know if I have the answer to, is that, and this will be long-term, I think long-term consequences, is its pervasive impact across every sector of society in every vertical, right? In other words, like, for example, I'll just give you an anecdote. I'm seeing my doctor. I saw my doctor for the first time last Friday. I said, like, think of every aspect of your life being impacted. So it's just more pervasive. That may bode well for thinking about how we do better next time, rather than I don't want to say more limited. It was a global recession, but in America, for example, what is it? One in every some crazy number, like 1 in every 2 people now knows someone close or 1 in 3 who died. That kind of emotional stress, I think, it just didn't exist in the economic downturn. But the response of how strong, this is a resiliency question, how strong in fact is our floor, right? Do we have a single points of failure? Can it be brought down? Those are the same questions we asked after 2008 that we need to ask now.
Great, thank you. We have a few questions coming in through the chat and the Q&A that are discussing a similar topic of more of a global cooperative response. So here's a question from Gallo. Many low-income countries, especially small island nation states, live in perpetual crises, already going through triple amplified threats, the pandemic, climate change, and an economic collapse. What are your thoughts, tactically speaking, on how to control all the risks occurring simultaneously, and where to invest for prevention in the future? And in a few years, in the whole world, we'll have extreme events coming together. So how can we prepare globally and build readiness?
Right. So I think that's great. I mean, that's what this is, the disasters are no longer random and rare. So how countries that are facing triple threats. So I'm going to talk like an American and annoy you probably, but hopefully this is the answer, is we have to make it in the strategic security interests of the large nations, the protection of the smaller, less affluent nations, as part of their security strategy. And I will say, for climate change, that's beginning to happen, right? This is what that we are beginning to see climate change, which we didn't even 10 years ago. That was an environmental issue. It was the Birkenstocks. It was, the polar bears, right? Now you have, military investments, military preparedness. We've got to make it in the secure, and fears, honestly, fears of a mass migration or refugees. Fears is the wrong word, but you know what I mean, the defensive posture. So I think in some arenas we're beginning to see it viewed as in the security interest, just like the Marshall Plan is in ensuring that these countries do not face the triple threat alone. I think this is also true, or will be true, of the pandemic, either because the next pandemic is likely to, I won't say likely, could start in one of those countries, but also that our capacity to bounce back is only as strong as the as the weakest link. I am, besides being faculty chair of the Homeland Security Program, I am faculty chair of something that did not exist. We opened it in October of 2019, you can believe it, and it was called the Global Health and Security Project. It's at the Belfer Center, because we wanted to bring global health into the security framework rather than thinking about it as we often did at the Kennedy School, thinking about it as, China versus us and Russia versus us, that we really had to think of it as security. And I think that's one strategy that is certainly takes resonance in the Biden administration and elsewhere.